Hello everybody, and welcome to the second part of Sonic Spitball. If the words second part didn't clue you in, this is the second part of an in-depth analysis I'm doing on Sonic the Hedgehog. If you haven't seen the first part, you can click this link, and hopefully I'll see you back here soon. In that video, I tried to demonstrate how the Sonic series keeps spitballing, or throwing ideas at the wall without really thinking them through. In this video, I want to demonstrate how poorly new ideas have been handled, and more importantly why that is harmful to the series as a whole. I intend to do this by looking at the non-gameplay elements of the Sonic series, its aesthetics, character designs, and of course the story. And if that didn't clue you in, there are hoofing great spoilers to follow, although honestly if somebody spoiled a Sonic the Hedgehog game for me, I probably wouldn't be wildly upset. Before we start, I'd like to take a minute to explain a few of the attitudes that made me want to make this video. I often see it touted that the graphics and story don't really matter to a game so long as the gameplay is good, and I completely disagree. Obviously this topic is quite complex, so I won't be covering it in depth, but suffice it to say that I find it's usually the context that motivates me to play a game. Furthermore, while a player can easily look past a lot of the elements I'll be discussing, from a designer's perspective, even the most inconsequential detail would have to be scrutinised. If the supposedly inconsequential details don't mesh, it might show that decisions aren't as judicious as they could be. Finally, I think that the aesthetics, story, and character designs are effective at demonstrating the problems with Sonic's spitballing. What all of this means in real terms is that you're probably going to find a lot of my complaints trivial. They aren't really intended to be reflective of a game's quality as a whole. I'm more interested in the philosophy behind the design decisions. So, fair warning about that. While I'm making fair warnings, I'd probably also better explain this up front. While I'm going to attempt to justify my perspective as much as possible, an intrinsic part of my argument here is that what I want from Sonic is absolutely not what other people want from Sonic. What I consider extraneous to the series, you might consider integral. I might slag off the very thing that got you interested in Sonic in the first place. I get that this stuff is subjective, and I also get that the Sonic series has survived 20 plus years and countless iterations. I can imagine that somebody who got into the series with, say, Sonic Adventure 2 would have a vastly different idea of what Sonic is than I do. In that case, a lot of my criticisms probably won't ring true. If you find yourself thinking this at any point, don't think I'm calling you wrong, basically. I can only really do things from my perspective, unfortunately, and I'm not here to try to wind you up. I'm going to basically do what I did last time and go through the series in roughly chronological order. The classic Sonic games plots were dead simple. Dr. Eggman has been kidnapping animals and intends to conquer the world with his robot army. Sonic's goal is to unkidnap or free the animals and put a stop to Eggman through liberal use of blunt force trauma. There's slightly more to it than that, depending on the game, but I don't think anybody will contest my saying that the original games didn't exactly have an intricate plot. What they had, though, was an excellent narrative. These games were extremely effective at communicating what little story there was to the player. The first way in which the story was communicated was through the game's environment design. Sonic had unique graphics, music, and enemies for every stage. Rather than simply being video game levels, they felt like complete areas, or zones if you will. The environments did an excellent job making the player feel like the world has a reason to exist outside of simply being levels for Sonic to run through. The foregrounds and backgrounds of every level are packed with personality and incidental details, painting Sonic's world as bizarre and surreal, but also packed with life and wonder. While life and wonder sound like flowery buzzwords, I've chosen them quite carefully. The backgrounds are filled with signs of life. Sprawling cities, manic entertainment complexes, and lush green fields help make the world feel lived in. It's also filled with wonder as there's a lot of detail and mystery to the locations. Mountaintops poke out from behind the clouds, and you can see crumbling temples, pillars, and totem poles in the backgrounds, and so on. It feels like Sonic's world has a purpose and a history outside of being a stage for Sonic and Eggman to have a punch-up. For me, the world looks interesting enough to explore, and so I play the game because I want to explore it. Sonic 1 made particularly effective use of its detailed and interesting world by using its aesthetics in order to demonstrate the world's plight. The levels emphasised the game's nature versus technology theme. Now, the importance of this theme is sometimes overstated, I feel. I don't think the game had anything really to say about nature versus technology. It's a theme rather than a message. It's used as an extremely effective method of letting the player know which ones are the goodies and which ones are the baddies. The game begins in Green Hill Zone, which is bright and filled with vibrant natural colours like browns, greens and blues if you've never been outside. From there, the game slowly progresses towards darker, more subdued colours in its industrial zones. The final zone, Scrap Brain, is made of greys, murky browns and olive colours which, combined with the tricky level design, make it feel claustrophobic and polluted. Contrast with the happy, carefree tone and gameplay of Green Hill Zone, and you can see how effective Sonic 1 is at communicating the world's plight. It starts you off in the area that Sonic is trying to save, and then later shows you what he's saving it from becoming. Sonic CD takes this concept and runs with it, no pun intended. The game's story sees Eggman travel back in time in order to gradually turn the miracle planet into a mechanical nightmare. It's up to Sonic to travel between the past, the present, and the future in order to put a stop to him. The player's actions in the game have a very real impact on the environment. The past is all natural and comfortable with the way that it looks, but if the player fails to destroy Eggman's cyberforming device, it'll eventually be transformed into a dilapidated dystopia. If the player succeeds in destroying the device, nature and technology advance in harmony, creating a utopian paradise. The colour scheme reflects these changes perfectly. The past is made up of natural colours as there has been no advancement in technology. The bad futures are made up of harsher colours and darker tones, like deep reds and purples. The good futures are made up of softer colours and lighter tones, light blues and pinks. Similarly, the music does a great job of communicating how well the player is doing. In Palm Tree Panic, if you get a good future, you're greeted with exultant cheers. In the bad future, the very same cheers that were congratulating you are pitched down to become a forlorn wail. Sonic CD is also the game that makes the best use of its fantasy setting in my opinion. It presents the player with bizarre, larger-than-life locations. For example, the whole game takes place on a tiny wee planet that is chained to Sonic's world by Dr. Eggman. That is an incredible idea that leaves a distinct and memorable visual imprinted on its players' minds. It's unfortunate that this idea has almost no bearing on the game itself, although I do love the touch that if you jump high enough you can see the other planet in the sky above, but I find this kind of imagination really appealing nonetheless. It's the landscapes during the special stages, however, that I feel have the most potential. Look at that palace. Now, tell me you wouldn't want to play a Sonic game where that was a level, where you could run across the cliff tops and look down at the world below. How about this subdued industrial zone? I'd love to see what was taking place inside those giant glass domes. This city appears to have giant structures that lean in from the outside, as if the city itself is in a glass dome. The scale and spectacle of these backgrounds, for me, add another layer of wonder and mystery to the world. Unlike the fields and temples found in Sonic 1 and 2, these are structures that simply could not exist outside of a fantasy. And I think it's a shame that we've never had the opportunity to actually visit them or similar locations. What Sonic 3 and Knuckles lacked in effervescent imagination, however, it made up for in attention to detail. Whereas Sonic CD has a brilliant style, Sonic 3 backs its appealing world up with some substance. The game takes place soon after Sonic 2, with the Death Egg having crashed on the mystical floating island, which isn't as original a concept as the Miracle Planet, but is still really appealing. Sonic and Tails head to the floating island because apparently they don't have jobs, and there they encounter the island's guardian, Knuckles the Echidna. Knuckles has been tricked into thinking that Sonic is the bad guy, and so he antagonises Sonic and Tails as they make their way towards the Death Egg. The game also serves as an origin story of sorts for the Chaos Emeralds, which were apparently used by the people that lived on the island and are controlled by the Master Emerald that Knuckles guards. So the plot is, again, functional but not spectacular. However, this was the series' first attempt at presenting a narrative from within the game itself, and I consider it an unqualified success. The story is told both through set pieces within the levels themselves and through cutscenes. These cutscenes are silent, to the point, and never more than a few seconds long. The player is never waiting long before they're back in the action again. The game is also beautifully paced. I don't know if it was always the intention to have the game reach a peak in the middle with the launch base zone, but it absolutely works in its favour. The game escalates as it reaches the launch base zone, where you achieve a minor victory over Knuckles and crash the Death Egg. Afterwards, the game sets up the second half of its story and gives the player a chance to catch their breath with the Mushroom Hill Zone. It eases the tension off enough that the quite lengthy adventure never becomes fatiguing, before building it back up again towards the game's climax in the Death Egg Zone. The story is enhanced through the creation of a more detailed, cohesive world. The zones have had even more effort put into their environments. Angel Island Zone, for example, is covered with waterfalls and thick foliage, and unique backgrounds and set pieces make every section distinct and recognisable. Halfway through Act 1 though, the scenery suddenly changes. Again, the plight of the world is communicated through a colour scheme which has gone from natural colours to violent reds and oranges. Unlike Sonic 1 though, the danger is established within the first few minutes of play, instantly contextualising the threat that Eggman represents. When the player reaches the end of the act, the game seamlessly transitions into Act 2. This has a huge impact on the player's understanding of their position in the world. Rather than the levels being completely detached from one another, they exist in relation to one another. This even extends to the transitions between zones. At the end of Act 2, Knuckles drops Sonic and Tails off a bridge, and they end up in the next zone. The game never fails to make sure that the player knows how Sonic got to where he is. It makes the game feel like a journey across the island, rather than just a series of levels. The detail that's put into these worlds also lends the game a wealth of different tones and atmospheres. Some basic examples include Hydro City Zone, where Act 2 opens with a wall chasing Sonic and threatening to crush him. The music complements this by becoming more frantic. The drums, rather than maintaining a steady beat, instead make heavier use of toms and put the snare drum on the offbeat to make it sound more like a scramble for your life. Carnival Night Zone makes heavy use of springs and bumpers to toss the player around. Using obstacles that can hinder the player without damaging them makes it seem more mischievous and annoying than dangerous in a lot of cases, which seems like the perfect fit for a carnival. The Ice Cap Zone is a frozen wasteland. It's not full of life, it's a quiet, desolate zone, and it sells its atmosphere through its music and its palette. The music is more subdued than a lot of other music in the game, and the palette makes heavy use of cool, harmonising colours. Contrasting colours would be more provocative and exciting, and so the game uses harmonising colours to sell its ambience, to make the zone feel more quiet and desolate. In addition to the atmosphere, Sonic 3 does a fantastic job telling its story and setting its mood through its gameplay. I'm going to use the Lava Reef Zone as my major example for this point. And, well, let me be frank, I love Lava Reef Zone. I don't think I can put into words how much I love Lava Reef Zone, but let me put it this way. I have names picked out for my future children. If it's a girl, I'm going to call her Constantine, and if it's a boy, I'm going to call him Lava Reef Zone. You spend the entirety of the Lava Reef Zone creeping closer and closer to the Death Egg in the background. The Death Egg approaching in the background built some anticipation for the end of the level, as well as gave the player an idea of where they resided in a 3D space, which was generally difficult for 2D games to do. You battle your way through Eggman's operations and giant mining machines that are, presumably, looking for fuel for the Death Egg. After a boss battle with a giant hand, which looks unfinished, foreshadowing the final boss, you reach Act 2, and from the second you enter that act, you know that something is up. The lava crystallises, and the music that plays is the same music you've been hearing every time you've entered the hidden palace to upgrade a Chaos Emerald. This implies to the player that something big is going to happen in this zone, and builds a lot of anticipation for the beginning of the end of the Mega Drive trilogy. Just as you close in on the Death Egg, Knuckles ambushes you, and then the Death Egg activates. The subsequent Eggman battle is a mad scramble of considerable difficulty, but once you get through it, you reach the Hidden Palace zone, where you finally have that long-awaited showdown against Knuckles. Immediately afterwards, Eggman betrays Knuckles, revealing to him after 10 zones of antagonism that Sonic was the good guy all along. Eggman makes off with the Master Emerald and uses it to finally launch the Death Egg proper. It's superb. The Lava Reef Zone is an incredibly engaging sequence. If you want to see how to do storytelling in linear games, how to invest your player in the conflict and motivate them to keep playing without shoving it down their throats, then look no further than the Lava Reef Zone. Effective storytelling isn't much though without effective characters. So let's take a look at the characters. Sonic the Hedgehog himself is without a doubt one of the best character designs I have ever seen. Everything Sonic is and does is reflected visually. His spines help to streamline his design and communicate that he's supposed to be fast. They billow out behind him in the direction that he's coming from, thus showing in what direction he's moving. But they also serve another significant function, showing how he can curl into a ball. The spines are curved slightly down, and they, alongside the shoes which together create a spiral motion, help to accentuate his ability to roll. Furthermore, his round head and body and his low centre of gravity when running help to accentuate the rolling motion. He leans forward and tucks his arms in, ready to curl up at a moment's notice. His ability to run is emphasised by his shoes, which contrast the rest of his colour scheme. As they are red, they are clearly visible against the blue, even when he's running so quickly that his feet are blurring. And everything in Sonic's design is encapsulated in his name. Sonic is often associated with the speed of sound, and the first things most people think of when they think of a hedgehog are its spines and its ability to curl into a ball. Sonic the Hedgehog runs fast and curls into a ball. Everything about him is designed to aid in communicating this. Sonic's face is also extremely effective at communicating expression. Now, I'm going to go into a bit of my own and others' character design theory here, so bear with me. The first concept I want to introduce is Scott McCloud's idea that the simpler a cartoon is, the easier it is for the reader to associate with it. In Understanding Comics, he says, when you look at a photo or a realistic drawing of a face, you see it as the face of another. But when you enter the world of the cartoon, you see yourself. Now, I'm not proposing here that when we see Sonic the Hedgehog, we mistake ourselves for Sonic the Hedgehog. What I'm saying is that the simpler an art style, the easier it is for an audience to empathise with the characters. With stipulation comes contradiction. The more detailed you make something, the more specific it becomes, and thus the more differences your audience can spot between themselves and it. For example, this simple face could represent me, but this detailed face could not, as I know that that is not me. Okay, simply put, the simpler a face is, the easier we associate with it. So how does this relate to Sonic? Well, this part is based on my own observations, so I could be wrong, but for me, in cartoons, the parts of the face that most influence expression are the eyes, including the eyebrows, the cheeks, and the mouth. Here we have a sad face. But that's not the whole story, as the eyebrows show that it is in fact a grumpy face. And for me, the cheeks emphasise that. Now, of course, that's incredibly simplified and there's more to it than that, but the explanation serves my purposes. See, all of the expressive bits of Sonic's face, the eyes, the cheeks, and the mouth, are very clearly delineated. The eyes are huge, taking up most of the face, and are separated from the rest of his face by a single, clearly defined line. Additionally, his eyes and eyebrows are, for all intents and purposes, one and the same, and his pupils are simply black dots, making whatever he's expressing with his eyes easily readable. His cheeks, unlike a lot of other characters, are separated from the rest of his face by his muzzle. A clear line and a changing colour allows his cheeks to be easily readable. Whichever way they influence or are influenced by his eyes and mouth is extremely clear. His mouth, of course, is basically the only significant feature on his muzzle. Whereas a lot of other characters have to make room for a nose, Sonic's nose is just plonked in the front like a jelly bean, giving his mouth a lot more space to express. His mouth also usually tracks the camera's angle. If you're viewing him from the side, his mouth moves around to that side to make it easy to see. Neo Totoshima obviously had a bit of a penchant for doing this, as a lot of these same principles are reused in another one of his character designs, Knight's. In basic terms then, Sonic's face is incredibly simple and also incredibly expressive. This, if Scott McCloud is to be believed, allows Sonic's audience to associate more closely with him. All of his expressions and characteristics are incredibly empathic. We can tell when he is surprised, angry, happy or mischievous, and if we're absorbed, we maybe associate with those emotions as well. And Sonic's expressiveness was put to excellent use in the early games. For me, Sonic was a cool character, but never because he was trying to be cool, as much as the advertising would have you believe otherwise. He was brash and confident, he grins and waves his finger at you when you succeed, but when he's fed up he'll let you know, tapping his foot and raising an eyebrow at you in an attempt to get you to move. He lost all composure when he took a hit or died, and his round body and big expressive face also undermined his coolness, as he was quite cute. His cockiness was always understated enough that it was never in your face or annoying. He reacted to the world around him in an undeniably self-assured way, but it was never exaggerated. A lot of people say that Sonic is a relic of the 90s due to his cool image, but I think that being cocky is a perfectly legitimate character trait, and one that fits perfectly with Sonic. His speed and his overconfidence give him a good excuse to get himself into scrapes, and also get himself out of scrapes, and just generally be a unique character rather than a blank slate. There's a huge difference between being cool and acting cool, if you see what I mean, and I think that Sonic hit the spot in the early games. Dr. Eggman juxtaposes Sonic well. His major colour is red, communicating danger and anger. While Sonic is all about expression, Eggman is all about hiding his expressions. Normally, his eyes, cheeks and mouth are all hidden behind his glasses and moustache, making him look expressionless. This means that when the player does see his face, usually when he's grimacing after having taken a hit, it's impactful and gratifying. While Sonic blends cute and cool elements to great effect, Eggman blends comical and menacing traits. His oversized moustache and exaggerated body shape are comedic, but his hidden expression, maniacal laugh and giant bloody robots help to establish him as a serious threat. It's important that the character presents himself as a threat despite his appearance. If he didn't, then the player wouldn't take him seriously, and it would be impossible for him to be an effective villain. And an effective villain Eggman is. Unlike a lot of other game baddies, he shows up to antagonise the player in every single zone of the classic series. He pesters the player so much that they become familiar with him and develop a grudge against him and want to take him down. This does have the slight disadvantage that in Sonic 1 and CD, the final bosses are pretty much interchangeable with the rest of the bosses in terms of impact, but Sonic 2 and 3 did a great job of upping the stakes with larger, more imposing robots modelled after the main villain himself. These more imposing robots also distinguished themselves further from the rest of the pack by being the only boss battles in the game in which you can't see Eggman. Tails' central concept is that he can fly and propel himself along the ground quickly by spinning his two tails, which is a really goofy idea, but a really appealing one for it. I like Tails' design. His eyes have a lot less focus on the eyebrows than Sonic's do, making him look more wide-eyed and innocent, and orange is, of course, the perfect complement to Sonic's blue. However, my problems start arising with Tails and his similarities to Sonic. Sonic is a hedgehog in order to allow him to roll. Tails, on the other hand, is a fox, and I find it kind of dubious that he can roll. I'm not an expert in foxes, but I've got a pet dog, and after extensive testing I can confirm that she cannot do that. Even making the concession that he can, his rolling shouldn't be able to damage anything as he doesn't have spines, only fur. It feels like that choice was made for programming convenience rather than because it worked best with Tails' design. And that problem leads me nicely into Knuckles the Echidna. Knuckles has a really appealing design, but it does a rather poor job of communicating all of his abilities. We'll start with what works. His smaller eyes and a longer muzzle make him slightly less expressive than Sonic and Tails. This makes him seem more reserved, which makes perfect sense for a character that has knowledge of all of his island's hidden traps and secrets. Supposedly Knuckles' focus was on breaking walls, and this is communicated instantly by his massive wrecking ball hands and spiked knuckles. These knuckles also tie into his ability to dig and climb walls. Additionally, it was specifically decided that Knuckles was an echidna due to their ability to, like hedgehogs, curl into balls. His spines, unlike Sonic's, lead down, still communicating the direction that he will roll in, but also making him look bulkier and less streamlined, which seems appropriate. The spines also lead the eyes down to the hands. His knuckles are his defining trait, and it's nice that his character was designed around this. So far, so good. But the problems begin arising with Knuckles' ability to glide, which isn't communicated on his character at all. Now, I'm not saying they ought to remove his ability to glide, I like his glide, but I think it's worth noting as a bit incongruous. The major problem I have with Knuckles, though, is that he has absolutely no business being fast. You see, thematically, Knuckles is supposed to be Sonic's antithesis: ancient instead of modern, red instead of blue, strong instead of fast. But he isn't, he's strong and fast, because the gameplay requires this to be the case. It would have been a lot of work, and not to mention a huge risk, to design an entirely new gameplay style from the ground up. Now, I am glad that they made the decision that they did. It's unlikely that Knuckles would have been as fun to play if he had played vastly differently from Sonic and Tails. However, I think it hurts suspension of disbelief a little, not to mention undermines the impact of Sonic's supposedly unique powers. It communicates a bit of a problem with the series. Do you remember last time when I said that Sonic's focus and speed kind of limits what the games can be expected to do? This is one such example. All of the characters must, in some way, be designed like Sonic. While this lends them the same strength of expression that he has, it also means that Tails and Knuckles both have the same body type, and both have the same abilities, even when those abilities might not make much sense for that particular character. Therein lies the quandary. If the characters look like Sonic and play like Sonic, they begin to come up short as far as character design goes, as well as undermine Sonic's credibility. He feels less special if everybody else, including even a 6-year-old, can move at super speed. On the other hand, if the characters don't look like Sonic or play like Sonic, they're less fun to play as a result. Sure, it's not a big problem. It's fairly obvious that Sega have chosen gameplay, and I absolutely think that's the right choice, as it lends the games the strength of being committed to a central idea. But, you know, it's a thing. Metal Sonic, ironically, and I love this, suffers from the exact opposite problem. He is an incredible design in my opinion. The turbine being used in place of Sonic's tan torso is an incredible idea, and I'm particularly fond of how his feet work as well. But he's never used as Sonic's equal. He always uses lasers and electrical fields, or floats above you and throws things at you, and it kinda defeats the purpose of him being a metal Sonic. It's funny that the only one that could get away with acting and playing like Sonic rarely ever acts or plays like Sonic. Now, the last individual character we come to is Amy Rose, whose design I unfortunately just find incredibly lazy. Now, the idea of her being a massive Sonic fan is a fun twist with a lot of potential in my opinion. It fits perfectly in with Sonic's self-assured, marketable image, and gives the pair a lot of scope to play off of one another. However, because she goes about it without an ounce of self-awareness, notable exception being Sonic Adventure, it just comes across as annoying. When her only interaction with the player in Sonic CD is to attach herself to them at the end of Palm Tree Panic, it doesn't effectively motivate the player to save her after she's kidnapped. It also kind of means that Amy's entire existence is in reference to Sonic, and in that sense her design is apropos. She is literally just a pink Sonic, which is without a doubt one of my least favourite design concepts. She has no reason to be a hedgehog other than because she is the girl version of the main character. She can't curl into a ball, and she rarely makes use of her spines. Her lack of identity isn't really helped by her name. Now, the Sonic naming convention usually attracts some derision, but I think that the names are usually really effective at communicating what the character's about. I've already mentioned Sonic above, but another great example would be Blaze the Cat. She has fire powers, Blaze, and she's aloof and a bit of a loner, Cat. It's not complicated, but it works perfectly. Amy Rose, on the other hand, communicates absolutely nothing about the character outside of a vaguely romantic spin. The final piece of character design I'd like to look at is the designs of the animal buddies. You know, the wee animals that popped out of the badniks once you destroyed them, yeah, those things. These are in no way a bad inclusion. I feel that they easily contextualise the nature versus machinery conflict at the heart of the game, and they give the player more incentive to smash badniks. But I've always thought that they were weird. In the comics, the animals that Sonic freed were consistent with his design. They felt like they occupied the same world. In the games, I've always felt that it was strange for there to be two variations on anthropomorphic animals side by side. Sonic is upright, wears shoes and gloves, is blue and is much larger. The animal buddies usually run on all fours, wear nothing, have colours generally befitting the respective animals, and are much smaller than Sonic, even the seal. It's weird. It's also kind of weird when you smash a badnik in Sky Chase and one of the animal buddies, who demonstrably lacks any method of flight, goes plummeting to his death. Or, for example, what about Egg Utopia? All of the animal buddies left in that would almost certainly be dead considering the ending. I know that's trivial, but it feels to me like the only place that the world contradicts itself. At the very least, I think it's kind of telling that in the cartoons and other related media, which had to focus on the story and thus had an even greater emphasis on presenting a consistent world, the animal buddies were never reused, despite them being an undeniably iconic concept. Now, look, I'm not sitting here going that Sonic 3 is worsened because of the inclusion of the animals. No, I don't even notice them when I'm playing. There is a point to this observation, and we'll be seeing it crop up at least once more before this video is over with. For now, I'm going to leave that there, and we'll see how many people it bugs as time goes on. Besides a few hiccups with the character design then, the classic series is my major argument for why I think that Sonic is best positioned as a fantasy adventure. A lot of effort went into giving the characters in the world they inhabit some personality and some consistency. The world and the gameplay undeniably make an effort to make Sonic's world feel like an actual environment, rather than a video game level. The environment is affected by external influences, the time zone for example, or Eggman's meddling. These changes are reflected in the game's mood. Its colour scheme and music present a tranquil and mysterious world that is in genuine danger from fire, pollution, and industrialisation. The player can ignore the effort that went into the world, as it complements rather than interferes with the gameplay, but personally I find the world really appealing, and so it does an excellent job motivating me to play. Additionally, the main characters fit into the world perfectly, and exude personality. As a result, I care about this world and its characters. I'm not going to pretend that it's emotionally complex, but it's at least compelling, and I don't think that the effort, or its effect on the audience, ought to be sneered at because it's a cartoon hedgehog. For me, fiction is so brilliant because things don't have to be serious in order to be taken seriously. Through effective storytelling, an audience can find themselves caring about, say, a plastic cowboy becoming jealous of a plastic spaceman, or an ice wizard singing the Cheers theme. So then, I feel that the classic series was largely successful at presenting its world and story. I mean, it would make sense for the Sonic series at this early stage not to have a problem with spitballing a ton of new ideas. Unfortunately, it kinda bloody does have a problem with spitballing a ton of new ideas. Even as early as this, the Sonic series was throwing ideas at the wall with full force. In addition to the games, there was an off-the-wall and hyperactive television series, another darker and grittier television series, a television series that casts Sonic as a prince who was in a band with two of his siblings, a comic series that went from being a children's comedy to a relationship drama, a comic series that played out like a combination of Marvel, 2000 AD and the Beano, a video movie from Japan, and probably a bunch more besides. I get the feeling that Sega weren't particularly reluctant to hand out the Sonic license, let's put it that way. And while this created legions of Sonic fans, it also fundamentally divided them. These different continuities all had massively different stories, worlds, and tones. To many, Sonic was a comedy. To many, Sonic was a dark drama. To me, Sonic was a narcissistic arse. Even at this early point, franchise disparity was setting in, and this really came back to bite Sega when Sonic Adventure rolled around. Sonic Adventure's story is one large narrative told from 6 characters' perspectives. Eggman has shattered the Master Emerald, thereby releasing the ancient monster Chaos. He intends to gather the Chaos Emeralds in order to make Chaos stronger, and eventually use them to destroy a city called Station Square. It's up to Sonic and Tails to nab the Chaos Emeralds before Eggman can. Meanwhile, Knuckles wants to reconstruct the shattered Master Emerald, E102 Gamma gains sentience and rebels against Eggman, a cat called Big tries to retrieve a frog, and Amy tries to avoid getting kidnapped because she's a girl in a video game. Now for me, an effective game story is one that enhances the gameplay. By that, I don't mean anything too complicated. It can be something as simple as making the game's environments feel more connected. Unfortunately, Sonic Adventure's story is a worst case scenario as it often disrupts the gameplay. See, while the story is simple, its presentation is extremely complicated. A lot of time and effort evidently went into the story, and I feel that this effort was kind of misplaced. Now, the cutscenes aren't totally detrimental. As I said last time, the hub world fulfills the same purpose as the cutscenes from Sonic 3, in that it creates a more cohesive world. In Sonic Adventure, the cutscenes are instead dedicated to the characters' motivations, why they're heading to the next level, or why they're fighting the next boss. I think this is a worthwhile reason for their inclusion, even if just because they tell the player where to go next. The problem is that they are far longer and far more in-depth than they ever need to be in order to accomplish this task. The story is never complicated enough that it needs the amount of time it takes. The characters' motivations are straightforward and usually fairly constant. The villain's schemes aren't particularly complicated, and it's always fairly clear what you're supposed to do next. As such, I feel that the length and the frequency of these cutscenes often far outweigh their importance. The point of the cutscene that's playing just now, for example, is to establish to the player that Eggman is going to try to stop Sonic from reaching him, which, that's pretty obvious and doesn't need a minute-long cutscene to explain. Besides all of this, most of the time the cutscenes utterly destroy the pacing of the game. The cutscenes are lengthy and often interrupt the player when they just want to head to the next chunk of gameplay. Now, of course, the cutscenes are skippable, but in that case, that's a huge amount of time and effort wasted on a part of the game that a lot of people won't care about. The cutscenes had to be planned with reference to the levels, plotted, written, the voices recorded, and the scenes animated. There's an even bigger problem though, in that these cutscenes often interfere with the pacing of certain characters' playthroughs, as those characters have to be slotted into the overarching narrative. The biggest offender I can think of is Tails, who has to get through 3 sub-games and 2 bosses between his 3rd and 4th levels. This decision wasn't made for gameplay purposes. The reason he goes through such a huge break between 2 levels of his core gameplay is because the story dictates it. Furthermore, if you've played as Sonic and Knuckles before this will be the second time you've played 2 of those sub-games, the second time you've faced both of those bosses, and the 3rd time you've watched these cutscenes, which have had even more time wasted on them as all the lines have been rewritten and re-recorded for each character. The cutscene still plays out in exactly the same way, and so the player is even more likely to skip it, meaning even more time wasted from a development perspective. Now, all of that said, the emphasis on story does make sense in Sonic Adventure. The game was trying to sell the Dreamcast's hardware, and extensive voice acting and cutscenes were probably a good way to do this. Furthermore, I find myself kind of enjoying the cutscenes a lot of the time. They do overstay their welcome, but Sonic Adventure's story is quite good in my opinion. The characters are likeable and consistent, and it expands the history and characters of Sonic's world in a way that feels appropriate. While it's straightforward in terms of broad strokes, it has just enough twists and turns to keep you interested, and the strength of the interconnected stories is seeing how everybody got to where they are without any exposition being necessary. If you're curious as to how Knuckles got tricked, then simply play his story to find out. Most importantly though, Sonic Adventure has an appropriate tone. It's adventurous and exciting, and it never takes itself too seriously. I'm not really trying to say that the cutscenes should or shouldn't be there, but I do think they represent a significant investment of effort that I think would be better placed elsewhere. On a related note, there's a ton of debate surrounding the voice acting in the Sonic series. Now, I honestly expected to come into this in defence of the voice acting, as I've never really had too much of a problem with it, as even at its worst it's entertaining.
No problem, he's just a chunk of cheesy hardware.
However, the more I thought about it, the more I found myself questioning its inclusion. I'm not going to say whether or not there should be voice acting, but I do want to leave you with some food for thought. Firstly, the risk-reward factor. Again, it involves time and effort to script and record voice work of a decent quality, especially in multiple languages, and there are a lot of risks associated with voice acting. A number of people are likely to not care about the voices, and in a worst case scenario, the voice cast might have a detrimental effect on the player's experience. In that case, that's a huge amount of resources wasted. Secondly, if a story needs dialogue to get itself across, it might be too complicated for a Sonic the Hedgehog story. I described earlier how Sonic 3 managed to tell its story perfectly, completely silently, and I think that the temptation with adding dialogue is to make the story more complicated than it needs to be. Third, a lack of voice acting gives the games less chance to be tonally inconsistent. Bits like the friendship speeches in Sonic Unleashed and the swearing in Shadow the Hedgehog strike me as extremely out of place, and both of these examples wouldn't have been an issue had dialogue not been involved. Fourth, I think that dialogue has the potential for contradiction. The less dialogue there is, the less chance there is for the character to contradict an individual's perception of that character. Finally, what I consider to be the most moving scene in Sonic's history, the only scene to have anything resembling emotional complexity, was done without using a single word. While I totally understand people liking the voices though, I think a general rule is not to have conversations during gameplay. This was a huge problem in Sonic Heroes, and I guarantee that it will crop up again before this video is done. It's distracting and often repetitive, especially if a player loses a life and has to restart a section. I'm jumping a fair bit ahead here, but the Egg Dragoon from Sonic Generations makes a pretty good argument for no voice acting all on its own. While Mike Pollock's Eggman is a joy to listen to, it nevertheless becomes tiresome when he constantly repeats the same lines over and over, to the point of being ridiculous.
Time for a change of pace! Time for a change of pace!
Conversely, I think a much greater impact is achieved when Sonic silently dusts himself off at the end of this battle. If he had spouted a cool one-liner, I think the impact would have been diminished. Anyway, that's in 2011 and I'm still not done with 1999. Up until now, I've been complaining about Sonic Adventure's inherent problems, but I feel that one of its biggest problems is in how it impacted the series as a whole. You see, up until 1999, although there were plenty of continuities, you could pretty much rely on a set number of consistencies between them. Tails was Sonic's underconfident yet earnest sidekick. Sonic's arch-nemesis was Dr. Robotnik, and Sonic lived on a planet called Mobius. So when Sonic Adventure rolled around in 1999 and followed the Japanese continuity, telling us that Tails was a mechanical genius, Sonic's arch-nemesis was called Dr. Eggman, and that Sonic lived on Earth, it was a bit jarring to say the least. I want to rag on these points. Can I rag on these points? Tails being a mechanical genius is kind of out of place for the kid's sidekick in my opinion. I like him being a pilot as thematically it fits with his propeller tails, but having him be a genius capable of feats like the Tornado 2 is a bit of a stretch in my opinion, especially as this aspect of him is reflected nowhere on his character design. Besides all of this, at only 8 years old, Tails can run as fast as Sonic, can fly, and is as good with machines as Dr. Eggman. Tails is OP, Valve please nerf. Dr. Robotnik being changed to Dr. Eggman was a really stupid change, and not actually because I dislike Eggman. I'm used to it now, I think the majority of kids are used to it now, and I like it as it fits with the idea of him being a bit of a cleverclogs. Egghead, Eggman, you get it. But it was a stupid change nonetheless, as at the time that the change was made, Dr. Robotnik was a famous character, being the main antagonist of a pretty popular franchise. Of course changing his name was going to cause confusion. Even now, 15 years after the fact, people still refer to him as Robotnik. And I think this is at least partly caused by Sega's own trepidation about sticking to the name. They make oblique and infrequent references to Dr. Ivo Eggman Robotnik, obviously in an attempt to placate the old fans. However, it's incredibly ham-fisted, as in most instances the old name is either ignored or mocked.
Dr. Robotnik!
Nobody calls me that anymore.
I think the whole move would feel a lot stronger if they just ditched the old Robotnik moniker entirely, but in trying to have their cake and eat it, they commit only to indecision. The biggest change, however, and the one that has the biggest effect on the gameplay, is the change of Mobius to Earth. See, the Sonic fanbase is diverse, whether it be in our tastes, our opinions, our locations, the colour of our skin, our sexuality, but the one thing that I can safely say about every single person who has played a Sonic the Hedgehog video game is that they live on Earth. This means that everybody who has played a Sonic game can tell that something's not quite right, that this is not Earth. It's subtle, but if you look closely you might notice a cartoon hedgehog in this screenshot, which, after extensive research, I can confirm does not exist on Earth. Okay, sure, I'm being sarcastic, but I do feel that the decision to locate Sonic on Earth restricts the games as it has one of two detrimental effects. It either limits the environments to being slightly more realistic, in which case they are less suitable for a Sonic game, or it doesn't, in which case the levels are incongruous with the presentation of the rest of the world as Earth. To put that another way, the hub worlds appear to present a stylised Earth, whereas the levels themselves present a world that is demonstrably not Earth. The clash makes the world that bit less cohesive, and thus makes the gameplay that bit less engaging to me. I feel there's only something to be lost by setting Sonic on Earth, and I think that, conversely, there's no disadvantage to setting it on Mobius. That is the name that most people are accustomed to calling it, with most of the rest now calling it simply Sonic's World, which is a duff name, and frankly, I like Mobius. It sounds cool, like never ending. Plus, it associates the planet with Sonic's spinny legs, which are a Mobius loop. The decision to relocate to Earth also had another problem, which ties into that nitpicky problem I talked about earlier with the Mega Drive games. Remember that complaint that I had about the animal buddies not really seeming to fit in the same world as Sonic? Well, it's even worse when Sonic the Hedgehog stands next to a human being. It looks like two different games mashed together. The game really likes framing this contradiction explicitly. You're not supposed to bat an eyelid at a cartoon hedgehog standing right in front of a realistic orca, or a cartoon cat hanging out with a realistic frog. It's like photoshopping Bugs Bunny into the animals of Farthing Wood. It looks weird to me. So now we have established in Sonic's world, Sonic and his ilk, the animal buddies, humans, and realistic animals. You can probably see the problem by this point, but if not, I'll be coming back to it one last time before the end. Now, I understand that Genius Tails Eggman Earth was the way it always was in Japan. But frankly, I don't consider that a defence. Sega ought to have been keeping tabs on how their franchise was perceived globally. When it came to incorporating a more involved story then, they probably ought to have alerted the team developing the game that, for most of their audience, the story they were writing was going to directly contradict what people thought they knew about Sonic. I know we're all used to it by now, but I distinctly remember being quite confused when I first started playing Sonic Adventure. And that's kind of the thing, whether these changes are good or bad is really besides the point. I have my preferences, but the changes are so entrenched in the franchise now that people are going to like and prefer them. The thing I want to put across is that it was a bad, or at least a very risky decision, to change these elements in the first place. Sega only divided their fanbase even further. I mean, I personally was obstinately opposed to the changes for the longest time because I was so used to something else. Presenting people with an alternative tacitly asks them to have preferences. And if you're about to type or have already typed out a rebuttal in the comments, please do, because that's exactly the problem. They have fractured their fanbase so deeply that we are disagreeing about what the most basic story points of the series are. While the aesthetics are less focused than the Mega Drive games were though, Adventure's atmosphere is bolstered by an absolutely incredible soundtrack. There are a huge range of styles on display here. The music almost tells the story. Speed Highway has its dizzying, looping roads accompanied by a pulse-pounding song that frequently tells you that you're going up and down and all around. The game also gives you a sense of how high up you are and how fast you're going, with the wind whistling by in the background. Then you run down a skyscraper and the music becomes chaotic, like scrambling and tripping over itself. Once you reach the bottom, the music slows down and becomes more synthy and leisurely for a relaxed run through the city streets at dawn. Lost World breathes "I don't know" at the player every so often. In Red Mountain, after an exhilarating climb, the inside sells how hot it is through screams and wailing guitars. It's a very Sega way to create atmosphere in my opinion. Later games relied more on plain guitar riffs or fast tempos to sell the action, when I think Sonic Adventure soundtrack was there to sell the atmosphere and let the player handle the action, and I think it was much stronger as a result. It's all very poppy and memorable. Now, I'm going to wrap up again by talking about a few of the character designs in Sonic Adventure. Gamma is a really ace design, looking cool but also functional, instantly evocative of Dr. Eggman while also having a ton of his own unique traits. He has loads of hidden gadgets and modes. He also has some of the best lines, as every situation, no matter how ridiculous, is treated with a measured, deadpan pragmatism.
Found. Location unknown. This presents a problem.
His voice is great as well. It's like robotic, but it's not a generic robotic voice. I also really like Big the Cat. I think he's the perfect example of a character being really easily identifiable as a Sonic character without resorting to using the same face and body shape. Now, Amy I still have a lot of problems with. I don't think they knew what to do with her. I appreciate the attempt to move her away from simply being a pink Sonic, but now she's just like a pink cross between Sonic, Tails and Knuckles. She has Sonic's eyes, Tails' nose and tuft of hair, and Knuckles' dreadlocks. She also, for no apparent reason, now wields a giant hammer that she pulls out of nowhere. Again, I don't think they had an idea in mind, so they just slapped a hammer on her and called it a day. Now, sure enough, not everybody's quite as anal about character design as I am, but let me ask you this. What's the point of giving her an oversized hammer that makes her look unstoppable if her gameplay is centred around running away? A hammer, to me, communicates brute force and strength. I don't feel vulnerable with a giant hammer. Now, in their defence, there was no obvious solution to this problem that wouldn't involve fundamentally altering the character, but it's still kind of lazy in my opinion. But all of this is still ignoring my biggest problem with Amy, which is her incredibly short skirt. I don't think an incredibly short skirt is the best choice for a character that does a lot of flips. Give her a pair of trousers for goodness sake, nobody wants to... Oh, okay, I don't want to see that. Now, Sonic's redesign marked the first real evolution in character design that he had seen, and I think it's a very nice advancement of the classic style. It's a bit slicker without being too lanky. A lot of the decisions are very sensible. He's been made slightly taller and his spine's longer in order to exaggerate his animation in 3D. In the 2D games, his spines and legs only had to be shown from the side, so they could be much shorter and it would still be clear what they were. However, in 3D, as the camera is behind Sonic, the spines would point directly towards the camera, and the legs' animations would be less exaggerated and thus less clear. In order to accentuate the shape and movement, the spines and legs were made longer, which is a great decision in my opinion. Now, that said, I kind of miss the blurry legs, and I don't really get the whole ninja run thing that Sonic does now. Rather than lean forward, being ready to curl into a ball, his arms are thrown backwards, requiring him to lean back. It's not a huge problem, but I think it's less strong from an animation perspective. It makes him look like he's putting in less effort when he's going like the clappers. The other change to Sonic's design that I want to bring up is his eye colour. Whereas his eyes used to be black dots, they now have green irises. Now, before we continue, I have to stress, I have absolutely no preference about what colour his eyes are. It is such a minor detail that I literally couldn't care less, and this is coming from the guy that's just complained about Sonic's running animation. But I think the irises are worth scrutinising as a design decision, even if just to help elucidate why people might have an opinion on this. To start with, do you remember Scott McCloud from earlier? The simpler a face is, the easier it is to associate with it, that thing. I feel that plays a part in making the black irises easier to read. However, the big thing I feel about the black eyes is that they communicate clarity of intent. Now, this part is based entirely on my own observations, so bear with me here. I feel that the simpler eyes are drawn, the stronger a character's resolve is. Eyes, they say, are the windows to the soul, and if a character has simple, clearly defined eyes, it makes them look more intense, single-minded, and determined. Conversely, if their eyes are filled with details, the eye's presence is kind of obscured. There's more turmoil and doubt. Now, that sounds like pseudo-philosophical nonsense, right? But I think I can prove it. Take a look at this panel from Bakuman, where Mashiro, which is this fella, is looking through a shelf filled with manga. Now, despite it being a tiny picture at the bottom of the page, my eyes are immediately captured by the picture of Son Goku, the protagonist of Dragon Ball Z, at the bottom left. Now, Goku is one of the most single-minded characters out there. He is pure of heart and determined to overcome any challenges. His eyes reflect this clarity of intent. They're simple and intense, being made of semicircles and lines, with small, tight, focused black blobs for pupils. Conversely, Mashiro's eyes are much more detailed, and I think they command less presence as a result. To use another example, in Battle of Gods, Goku manages to power up, transforming into a Super Saiyan God, and while he's happy that he attained that power, he's also frustrated that he couldn't manage it by himself. As a result of his turmoil, his eyes become much larger and less focused. Now, back to Sonic. Although I feel that the green irises are slightly less clear and focused, I by no means think they look bad. They add a nice little splash of colour to Sonic's face, which was only made up of blues and tan colours before. The fact that they're green also draws attention to them, as nothing else on Sonic's design is green. I also think that larger eyes make a character look more compassionate. With the emphasis on storytelling in the later games, I think having larger eyes with a splash of colour drawing attention to them was a great way to make Sonic look more sympathetic. Finally, if we're assuming my clarity of intent idea to be true, then I think that the more complicated eye design works for Sonic. He's always been mischievous and had some tricks up his sleeve, and so the clear, pure intent communicated by black eyes might not be the best fit. Now, I say all that, but, well, to be perfectly honest, the reality of the situation is probably just that it's a stylistic choice. The new artist, Yuji Uekawa, probably just liked doing characters' eyes like that, so he did it. And that kind of makes that whole rant completely pointless. Now, the last wee bit I want to talk about with regards to Sonic's design is his personality. You see, Sonic is now cool. That sounds weird, right? Like, he was always cool. But I think there's a key distinction. In the classic games, Sonic being cool wasn't his personality, it was a result of his personality. He was cool because he was confident and cheeky. In the Sonic Adventure games, I can't help but feel that Sonic being cool was the idea rather than the effect. It feels like a boardroom decided how a cool dude should look and act. Extreme sports are cool, so Sonic now grinds down rails and does elaborate flips and stunts while on a snowboard. His old run wasn't cool, so now he does an awesome ninja run. He breakdances, and he says hip phrases like,
Oh yeah! This is happening!
I think the most expedient way to exemplify my point, however, is to compare the game's idle animations. In the Mega Drive games, he became impatient and tapped his foot sarcastically at the player. He was cool because he was impatient and irreverent. In the adventure titles, he stretches or looks around, shouting,
Better get going!
He's been rounded off, given less attitude, made more of a cool, laid-back dude. The problem is that, paradoxically, the quickest way to make something not cool is to try to make it cool. A lot of Sonic's lines, while I find them endearingly cheesy, really date the game. You can tell that this was something made in the 90s. I really think there was an increased emphasis on bodacious radicalness in the adventure titles, and this suggests to me an anxiety surrounding Sonic's image and how to keep him relevant. And this anxiety manifested itself in all of the worst ways in Sonic Adventure 2. Sonic Adventure 2's story is a lot less straightforward than Adventure 1's was. In essence, Eggman infiltrates a government facility that contains the ultimate life form, Shadow the Hedgehog, who just so happens to bear a close resemblance to Sonic. Shadow and Eggman then nick the Chaos Emeralds in order to power Eggman's grandfather's big space laser, because of course his grandfather had a space laser, and of course it's powered by Chaos Emeralds. Apparently double A's don't exist in Sonic's world. Meanwhile, Sonic is mistaken for Shadow and arrested, and it's up to him to break out of prison and head up to space in order to stick his big toe up Eggman's arse. Along the way, they encounter conspiracies layered on conspiracies, genetic experiments, an army called Gun, existential crises, and instead of fighting badniks, Sonic fights the government. These two stories play out across two different campaigns, Hero and Dark. Now, I'm not really interested in doing a blow-by-blow breakdown of the plot, as there's plenty of that out there, and this video's bloody long enough already. But suffice it to say that tonally, the game clashes with the rest of the series. Sonic Adventure 2 is really where the franchise began to take itself too seriously. Even in Sonic Adventure, disaster retained an appropriate tone. When perfect chaos destroys a city, it's treated like a triviality. It feels more like a monster movie than anything else. While I've defended Sonic being compelling earlier in this video, as I think it's supposed to be an adventure, the problem with taking him too seriously is, well, it's a cartoon hedgehog. For kids. Now, the more complex story made the cutscenes much more worthwhile in my opinion, as I feel that a lot of the levels and intents do require contextualization. The story jumps around in location quite a lot, meaning little to no continuity between levels, and making each feel more self-contained, so I think the cutscenes are once again necessary to contextualise why the characters are where they are. It's also quite interesting to play as the villains for once. It's nice to have a story driven by action rather than reaction. That said, the Dark story does have kind of the same problem that Tails had in Sonic Adventure 1, in that Shadow only appears in 4 levels throughout its 14-level campaign. Again, this decision wasn't made for gameplay purposes, it was made so that Shadow would fit into the story. Additionally, I think that the story could have done with a lot more streamlining, both for clarity's sake and to preserve the tone of the Sonic series. Aesthetically, the game is in much the same boat. The colour scheme focused more on blacks and greys, the locales became less surreal, with the most memorable zone basically being San Francisco, and the music incorporated less synth and brass than Sonic Adventure 1. In its place there were more guitar riffs, gloomy electronic music, and of course, Knuckles' infamous rapping. The way Sonic jumps had been changed as well. Rather than curling into a ball, Sonic instead did a series of forward flips, and instead of the classic sound effect, there is a whoosh sound. Now, I'm not about to sincerely condemn the game for changing a sound effect, but to replace such an iconic sound with such a generic alternative strikes me as a bad decision. So, again, I feel that Sonic Adventure 2 is where the franchise began to take itself a bit too seriously. And nowhere is this summed up more than in series newcomer and perennial fan favourite, Shadow the Hedgehog. Now, I am going to spend a fair bit of this video picking on Shadow, sorry Shadow fans, but I'm being genuine when I say that's only because I think he has the potential to be a really great character. I think Shadow has a brilliant design. Shadow is distinct while still being obviously related to Sonic. I associate them, but I could tell the difference between his silhouette and Sonic's, which is a best case scenario. It does mean it's a bit weird when everybody confuses Sonic for Shadow, but that's definitely not the most questionable bit in the story. I especially like Shadow's colour scheme. The crimson, black and yellow are very slick, and instantly identify him as a villain, as those are the three major colours in Eggman's design as well. It's not genius, but they're still the best colours for the job in my opinion. I'm also a big fan of Shadow's rocket shoes. Besides being just a bit of a cool concept, they give his running animation a lot of weight and rhythm. There's a lot of the time that Shadow's personality is spot on in this game as well. He's a lot like Sonic in that he's confident and irreverent, but in a very different way. He's cooler and more level-headed, but that doesn't stop him from enjoying himself at multiple points throughout the story, hamming his speech up to Dr. Eggman at the beginning and enjoying the opportunity to show off. When he isn't trying to be complex, he's a really cool villain. But there's the problem. Shadow spends far too much time trying to be complex. At first glance, you'd be forgiven for thinking that he was perhaps Sonic's long-lost brother, or an alternate dimension Sonic, or a clone created by Eggman. But in fact, Shadow's story begins 50 years ago when a scientist named Gerald Robotnik decided that he wanted to make the ultimate life form. And if you're about to start picking holes in that, wait till you see the rest of it. This story really falls apart under even the lightest scrutiny. After creating a giant lizard, Gerald realises that the ultimate life form must in fact be a 3-foot tall cartoon hedgehog with all of the same powers as Sonic, except 50 years before Sonic ever existed, because what the hell else would the ultimate life form be? This has always baffled me. Shadow's entire existence is in relation to Sonic. He is far too similar for this to be passed off as coincidental. So what you are telling me is that the world's greatest scientist thought, 1, let's make the ultimate life form, 2, let's make the ultimate life form a hedgehog, and 3, let's give the hedgehog rocket shoes so that he can move at super speed. Then, coincidentally, half a century later, a hedgehog would be born that has all of those abilities naturally. And because, coincidentally, the scientist's grandson is that hedgehog's arch nemesis, he's in the perfect position to set the ultimate life form free and pit the two against one another. It's fortunate as well that this ultimate life form has undergone some trauma to make him evil, giving him the motivation to go along with the grandson's plan. It's unbelievable coincidence layered on unbelievable coincidence, and so my suspension of disbelief is shattered before the story has even started. Anyway, the military aren't happy that Gerald made a hedgehog, so they shut down the research and murder his 12-year-old granddaughter in cold blood. Gerald, in response, goes insane, reprograms the Ark to crash into the Earth, from jail somehow, is implied to have altered Shadow's memories to make him enact this plan, again from jail somehow, and then writes a diary that documents all of this. Like, a diary that actually says, "Dear diary, today I went insane." Then Gerald is put in front of a firing squad, like, on camera and everything, but not before telling Gunn all of his plans in great detail. He was also somehow capable of programming the Ark to play the footage of his execution when all 7 Chaos Emeralds were gathered. What a bizarre story this is. I don't wonder if some kind of deadline didn't hit halfway through redrafting this. Ignoring the plot holes, if you can't see the tonal inconsistency, let's try doing it this way. A 12-year-old girl has been murdered and her grandfather executed as part of a government conspiracy. Or, alternatively,
Maria!
do you see how that's something of a tonal shift? Anyway, Shadow becomes hell-bent on revenge against all of humanity for this transgression, driven by what he thought were Maria's final words. During the finale though, it's revealed that Maria in fact asked him to protect humanity. Now, I think that Shadow's complicated story is often mistaken for a complex story. I don't think there are many subtleties or extra dimensions to it. The thing is, shaving it right down, cutting right to the quick, Shadow's story is that he's bad because he forgot he was told to be good by his dead friend, and when he remembers, he does a complete 180, forgets the last 50 years of his life, and goes to save the day. Now, I'm not denying Sonic the opportunity to have a dramatic story, and like I say, I fundamentally think I like Shadow. but I think it needs to be consistent in terms of tone and content with what has already been established. I mean, do you remember how I said that Sonic blends cute and cool elements? Well, Shadow kind of doesn't. Whereas the previous games frequently took a moment to poke fun at Sonic, Shadow maintains his composure throughout the game. Even when taking a hit, he doesn't look surprised or anything, he just kind of takes a step backwards basically. He's a more serious, tragic character, and I think it's just kind of out of place. His story could easily hit many of the same beats and be a lot easier to understand if he was simply a clone made by Eggman. You see, for me, his design is a clone of Sonic, and his gameplay is a clone of Sonic, so the easiest way to make him really feel focused is to make him a clone of Sonic. So let's do a wee fantasy scenario here where Shadow's a clone. This gives him the motivation to prove himself against Sonic, rather than the pair becoming territorial because another male Hedgehog exists. He gets sent on a mission to nick the Chaos Emerald, where he meets a girl named Maria, whom he befriends, and despite being a clone built for evil purposes, he slowly grows to realise that he doesn't have to be an awful turd. Now, that's a lot more cliché, and I'll readily admit that. But for me, that story has the potential to hit a lot of the same beats as Shadow's story, as well as capture a lot of the same themes as Shadow's story. Him being a clone also gives him that free will, nurture over nature theme that comes about if you believe that Gerald really did reprogram his mind. In addition to this, I feel that the tone is a lot more appropriate, and it's a lot easier to understand. I just can't help but feel that the consternated effort to make Shadow complex and tragic has made him tiresome. They even give him a heroic death scene at the end that is undone in the very next game. That move had a complete lack of foresight. It was obvious that people were going to like Shadow, and so it was obvious that Sega were going to want to bring him back. I think it's telling that the scenes in which Shadow is coolest are the scenes in which he acts like a straight up villain, an evil Sonic basically, which I think could have been accomplished by him just being a clone or something. Of course, that's me. As I've established, people are going to have different opinions, and to many, Sonic is gritty and serious, and this is the way that Shadow should be. But even so, I feel that there are plenty of ways to create emotional weight that would be a lot more appropriate for Sonic. The comics, for example, usually do a good job of drama without over-egging the pudding. And speaking of over-egging the pudding, Rouge the Bat, everybody. At the risk of sounding like a huge pervert, I actually like Rouge's design. She's evocative of a kitschy spy movie femme fatale, with the love heart motif tying her whole design together. She's consistent and well designed. It's just the proportions. I don't think I need to explain it, it's a cartoon bat, it's a bit weird. Now, before I move on, a few people were asking me why the games from Sonic Adventure 2 to Sonic Colors weren't represented in the last video, which is a totally legit question. Basically, I always envisioned this to be an exploration of Sonic's broad problems rather than a comprehensive retrospective. Honestly, the problems with the games from Heroes to Unleashed are well documented, and besides which I don't feel they contribute much to my overall argument that isn't covered elsewhere in the video. And these videos are long enough that I don't really want to go over everything simply for completion's sake. Now, I mean, obviously I do have my problems with these games, such as the fact that nobody in Heroes shuts up during the levels, but, well, if you're looking for something more in-depth with these games in particular, I can only apologise. Now, that said, there are 2 points that I'd like to cover, and this seems like the best time to cover them. The first point is Shadow the Hedgehog, as in the game rather than the character. I'm not going to sum up the story as, frankly, I don't understand it. You go through 10 different parallel scenarios which are on a spectrum of pure evil to angelic holiness. But the gist of it is that Shadow is tasked by a mysterious alien invader with collecting the 7 Chaos Emeralds. Shadow somehow jumps to the conclusion that collecting them will reveal his past, which motivates him but not the player, as the player should already know his past if they've played Sonic Adventure 2. Also, why doesn't he just ask Rouge? She was there for the whole thing, just ask her. Anyway, long story short, Shadow is an alien, and this is the point at which the Sonic series reaches maximum stupidity for me. See, the thing about this is that this whole scenario, an amnesiac alien cartoon hedgehog wielding firearms and going through a moral dilemma, sounds like a Simpsons joke. It tried to make Shadow cooler in the most juvenile way possible. He broods, he doesn't care in the most self-important manner, he's deliberately unhappy, he teleports, he can stop time, he can shoot lasers, he rides a motorbike, he uses firearms. And it is totally serious about making Shadow cool, but without even the semblance of levity, the stupidity of the whole situation sticks out like a sore thumb. The juxtaposition is unintentionally hilarious. A 12-year-old girl gets shot in the head and then it cuts back to a grimacing cartoon hedgehog. The president makes a speech about never surrendering to terrorists with a picture of Sonic and Shadow on his desk. It's trying well too hard, and what was a cool character is turned into a walking parody of himself. I think the story that they were trying to tell here is well beyond the scope of Sonic the Hedgehog, and I think that ought to have been recognised. Like I said last time, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you any of that, but the fact is the Sonic series was spitballing with such reckless abandon that it was experimenting with a tone and a genre that it should never have even attempted in the first place. The second problem I'd like to talk about is that Eggman is no longer remotely a credible threat. In practically every game around this point, his position as the main baddie is usurped, often at the last minute, by the secondary antagonist. Chaos, BioLizard, Metal Sonic, Black Doom, Iblis and Mephiles, and Dark Gaia. That's not even counting Emerald, Gemerald and Eggman Nega. Yeah, seriously, look 'em up. It got really predictable by the time Dark Gaia rolled around, and I think that it showed a massive lack of faith in the series' main villain, and in fact one of gaming's most iconic antagonists. Sonic Colors and Generations, fortunately, reinstated Eggman as the main villain, and had much more straightforward storylines as a result. In Colors, Eggman is kidnapping aliens and Sonic goes to stop him, and in Generations, Eggman breaks time and Sonic goes to stop him. I'm glad of the lighter tone of these two games after the series began to take itself too seriously, but they go a step too far by almost being an explicit comedy. Any attempt to create tension is destroyed by Sonic cracking a terrible one-liner, Eggman making a buffoon of himself, or Orbot and Cubot just generally being Orbot and Cubot. This harms Eggman the most as he's generally bumbling and incompetent, and thus making it impossible for the games to be as compelling as Sonic 3 was. Eggman is a joke throughout the games, and telling us at the end, no, he's a threat now, for real you guys, simply isn't enough to effectively escalate tension. I understand that Eggman has always been somewhat comical, but sometimes the most comical characters can be the most threatening of all. See the Joker, for example. Eggman's presence is also continually undermined by his two new lackeys, Orbot and Cubot. These two don't at all affect the gameplay or the story in any way, they are the most blatant of comic relief characters. Now, despite all these niggles, I am quite pleased to see that Sonic's back to having a bit of an attitude. From Heroes to Unleashed, they became a bit more of a generic, nice guy hero, and I think that shows how bland Sonic would be if they were to remove his attitude. Anyway, Colors and Generations also cemented a problem with on-screen prompts that began in Unleashed. This is a complaint of mine with a lot of games, but I feel that it's worth bringing up here. See, there are a number of times in Unleashed, Colors and Generations that the game will break the player's involvement by throwing great big button prompts on screen, telling them how to tackle the next obstacle. This is fine the first couple of times for tutorial purposes, but it persists throughout the entire game. While the heads up display blends into the background for me after a while, when I see a great big X button appear with fanfare in the sky above Sonic's head, I go, oh yeah, I'm playing a video game. This problem is particularly bad in, say for example, Rooftop Run, which is the second to last level of the game, which still throws great big prompts on screen telling you how to do the sidestep and drift. This problem also kind of extends to Sonic's targeting reticules when doing the homing attack, and the little death icons indicating that there's a bottomless pit. All of these little touches serve to break the world up for me, and remind me that these are game levels. Now, these aren't huge problems at all, and they do kind of work for such an unabashedly arcadey experience as the modern Sonic formula, but I thought they were worth talking about as I find them a wee bit inconspicuous. The last thing I want to talk about with modern Sonic are the aesthetics. Sonic has been made much lankier and given much longer spikes in his modern incarnation, and while it's definitely not my favourite design as I think it looks a bit awkward, I think it works with the modern Sonic formula. Modern Sonic rarely curls into a ball, and his gameplay is centred around running. This design then makes a lot of sense to me as it emphasises his legs and de-emphasises his roundness. As for the world, well, yeah, spot on. The music and colour schemes convey the mood of the level perfectly. Planet Wisp, for example, juxtaposes the greens and blues of its natural segments with unnatural reds and purples during its industrial segments. The music conveys this theme perfectly, being wonderful but also kind of sorrowful. Generations also did a great job working with what it had. Speed Highway became a bit more colourful, making heavy use of neon blue, and filling a rooftop run with confetti and balloons to give it that little pop was an excellent touch. All of that said, I am a little bit disappointed that these games didn't really seem to have much ambition beyond presenting a series of video game levels. All of these worlds are internally consistent, but they deliberately choose a structure that allows them to be delineated from one another. What this means is you get less of a sense of progression, less of a sense of like being on a grand adventure. It just feels less ambitious than like Sonic 3 or the adventure titles. The last game I'm going to look at in this series is Sonic Lost World, which as I've established is an incredibly confused game. The game sees Sonic and Tails crash land on a thing called the Lost Hex, where Eggman teams up with a group of things called the Deadly Six. The Deadly Six, by the way. That's a disastrous name, it's totally devoid of imagination. They're vaguely deadly, and there are 6 of them, so they are the Deadly Six. The bad scientist keeps the Deadly Six under control using a magic conch, and when the fast Hedgehog destroys it, the Deadly Six turn on him, using his machines to destroy the world below. Sonic and Eggman reluctantly team up in order to put a stop to them. Now, there are a number of things that I like about Lost World's aesthetics. It scaled Sonic's proportions back to reasonable lengths in order to emphasise his rolling rather than his running. It created a new jump sound, which is an excellent compromise between the iconic sound effect and the less invasive whoosh. Lost World also saw the return of a number of classic design conventions, the capsules for example, or the badniks who are back in full force, with simple, bold, streamlined designs. Overall, the whole thing just feels a lot more like a Sonic game. This even extended to the music. I don't like all of it, as I feel a lot of it is too ambient. But there's a lot of synth-based songs in there that I associate quite strongly with a Sonic vibe, particularly stuff like Frozen Factory. The game seemed to also recognise the problem with Sonic's lighter tone in recent years, but unfortunately due to some sloppy writing, the problem only became even worse. The game, rather than decide on an appropriate tone, instead flip-flopped between incredibly childish comedy and incredibly childlike darkness. It's kind of poorly written in my opinion, with jokes and dramatic lines often, not always, but often completely bombing. The weight of the dramatic lines is completely destroyed by a childish joke, and the light-hearted humour of the childish jokes is usually soured by a dark and dramatic line. Within literally seconds in this cutscene, we go from a childish insult about Eggman being fat to Eggman threatening to eat people's black hearts. Immediately afterwards, we get a joke about Eggman's moustache, and then Eggman goes nuts, threatening to strangle people and wanting to watch everything they love burn. Sonic legitimately says the phrase, contemplating genocide, but then they have a guy going, uh-oh, I forgot mustard on my literally 20-foot long sandwich. Tonal whiplash aside, a lot of the writing is uninspired, if not outright lazy. We get jokes like, the only thing that's gonna get conquered is your face, Eggman, and I'm sorry you're such a loser, which are really unoriginal. But what makes it even worse is how smug the game is about presenting these lines, with characters often reacting as if it's quality banter. Here I know it's for kids, but frankly I think that argument is doing kids a disservice, and furthermore the target audience has no bearing on the quality of the writing. Besides which, if it really is a kids game, you might not want to be including descriptions of graphic violence. The uninspired writing also results in the drama feeling really disingenuous. It is clearly supposed to be dramatic a number of times, but the lines are so needlessly melodramatic, or else trying to be edgy, that it comes across as forced. Additionally, in order to create drama, the characters have to be believable and consistent. A lot of the source of the drama in Lost World is Sonic blaming himself for unleashing the Deadly Six. He gets really mopey, and Sonic and Tails get really passive-aggressive with one another. It feels quite out of character, and it results in a really unpleasant atmosphere. But more than that, nobody thinks to blame Eggman. Sonic made a mistake with the best of intentions, and the game treats him like a punching bag for it. But Eggman was the bad guy in all of this, and he's treated like a paragon of virtue. It seems to be running on the deliberately silly logic that being a villain is just what Eggman does, and he can't help that, which is fine as a gag, but it uses it as the backbone for massive amounts of tiresome melodrama. I mean, I know I said earlier that Sonic's cockiness would be excellent for getting him into scrapes, but I didn't mean this. I meant like Sonic runs headfirst into a situation and has to fight a giant robot, not Sonic runs headfirst into a situation and everybody dies and he gets depressed. I don't mean to disrespect anyone. Maybe there were some tight deadlines, or maybe the writers aren't that interested in Sonic, or maybe the writers were given some confusing guidelines or forced outside of their comfort zone. But whatever the reason, the game goes between humour that only the youngest of children would enjoy and overwrought, edgy drama that only kids preoccupied with not appearing childish would get a kick out of. I can't work out who this game is for, and I think that's a shame considering the amount of time and effort that evidently went into these cutscenes. But even ignoring the tonal whiplash between lines, the drama is completely undermined by how incompetent the villains are. The Deadly Six are, for me, the worst villains the series has come up with. They're all entirely one-dimensional, with their personalities being simply leader, crazy, fat, old, depressed, and girl. Yeah, really. Their designs, while distinct enough visually, are useless at communicating their skills and abilities. The crazy one has a big moon that he throws at you. The fat one does tornadoes. The old one magically manipulates fruit. The depressed one uses owls and electricity. And the girl one builds snowmen. Furthermore, their big special power is that they can manipulate magnetic fields, but where's that communicated on their design? They're all completely ineffectual as well, with not a single one of their plans going right. There's a bit where Tails is turned into a robot, and that is resolved within seconds. This is all emphasised by how easy they are to beat in the game itself. All of this would at least be tolerable if it weren't for the fact that the game seems so assured of the Deadly Six's appeal. After almost every level is a cutscene dedicated to showing the player what they're up to. They make an appearance in every second level of the game, and even when they're not on camera, they have a voiceover in these levels.
Oh man! I can't believe he made it this far!
Do you remember my complaint about voiceovers in the levels earlier? This is one of the major reasons I brought it up, with many of the lines appearing just after checkpoints, meaning that if you die, you have to hear the same poorly written joke over and over again, which does not help if you're becoming frustrated at the game's kinda clunky mechanics. See, I'm usually all for establishing a villain, but I think there's a difference between strongly establishing them and throwing them in the player's face. If they are going to be thrown in the player's face, it's absolutely imperative that they are appealing. Now, of course, appeal is all about opinion, and if you like the Deadly Six, I'm not trying to call you out with this. But for me, they were nowhere near interesting, humorous, or basically entertaining enough for me to want to spend any time with them. What kind of adds insult to injury here for me is the fact that the main villain, Eggman, is once again reduced to an utter joke. I'm going to spell this out in case it's not obvious. There has never been a more likeable, iconic, and just plain appropriate villain for Sonic the Hedgehog than Dr. Eggman. Lost World is not reserved about making Eggman the punchline, even outright stating that Tails is more intelligent than him. To put that another way, the sidekick is better than the villain at what the villain does. Now, I'm not sitting here preaching the holy sanctity of Dr. Eggman. This doesn't genuinely upset me, but it does make me think, why? Why continually undermine a demonstrably popular and iconic character? Probably one of the few characters from your series that has managed to penetrate pop culture at large. It reeks of confusion about what the series is all about. The fact that Eggman is continually undermined by or replaced with less effective, less interesting villains shows to me that the series isn't really sure where its core appeal is. And speaking of Eggman and confusion, I want to bring up something that really kind of encapsulates the problem with Sonic Spitballing for me. Lost World saw the return of the classic Badnik enemies, and for the first time ever in a Sonic game, Eggman explicitly refers to them as Badniks. But that has come 15 years too late, I'm afraid, as Badnik no longer has any meaning. You see, when I was a kid, I had absolutely no problem associating Eggman with the Badniks, as his name back then was Robotnik. The Nick suffix immediately associated Robotnik with his robots, even in my tiny child mind. Remember, I never had the instruction booklets as I was reading a serialised comic that didn't explain the connection explicitly every time. Now that he's called Eggman, the word Badnik no longer associates them. He calls them Badniks simply because that's what he called them over a decade ago. The series has moved on since then. In Robotnik's own words,
Nobody calls me that anymore.
And this is the problem with spitballing over 20 years worth of games. The series is inevitably going to amass an impressive library of names and ideas that have to be handled carefully. Mario handles this by hardly changing anything between games. Sonic, especially in Lost World, doesn't handle these assets carefully, and that results in an absolute mess of a series. And now that we've reached the end of the series, let's bring back an old, nitpicky complaint for an encore. Now in Sonic's world we have Sonic and his friends, the animal buddies, humans, realistic animals, cactus things, giant worms, and the Zeti. Taking into account the games I've skipped, we also have the Black Arms, and a bunch of rampant gods running all over the place. At long last I reached the point. I'm not sitting here going, they should take out the animal buddies, they're ruining Sonic. What I'm saying is, all of these things that look like they belong in different series when lined up like this, suggest to me that there is very little communication between artists, writers, and game designers. It suggests that there is little attention paid to the established elements in the series thus far. You'll notice I neglected to mention the Flickies, the Chow, and the Wisps, as well as stuff like the Time Eater. This is because they actually feel like they fit in a world with Sonic the Hedgehog. I'm not making an arbitrary distinction here. They have legitimate reasons to exist, both in story and gameplay terms, and they were designed to look like a part of Sonic's world. Conversely, almost everything on the Lost Hex feels straight out of Mario to me, with the Deadly Six reminding me more than anything else of the Koopalings. The Bio-Lizard and Black Arms look like something out of a sci-fi action game. The humans look either straight out of an anime, straight out of real life, or straight out of a Pixar movie depending on the game, while the realistic animals are, of course, realistic. Meanwhile, Dark Gaia, Iblis, Solaris, and in fact most things in Sonic 06 look like they belong in Final Fantasy. It's inconsistent, but it doesn't feel like that was the intent. It feels like Sega just introduced new elements without thinking how they would fit into the franchise as a whole. Franchise expansion is not at all a bad thing, but it needs to be integrated as naturally as possible into the existing elements of the series, rather than just smashing two things together. I think a strong direction is of paramount importance, but this feels like a mad scramble of elements. It doesn't feel like it's presenting a cohesive world. And while I appreciate that a lot of people don't really give a monkey's arse, the fact that they're not presenting a cohesive world suggests to me that they're also not really presenting a cohesive idea. It doesn't feel like Sega are choosing a direction and sticking with it. And I think that attitude is harmful even to those of us that only care about the gameplay. Sonic is cool because he's cute, cheeky, and has some cool superpowers. What made Eggman menacing was that he thought he was menacing. He looks goofy, but he also builds giant space stations and death rays, and you kinda have to respect that in a man. I think the series' turn to dark drama, then all the way back to explicit comedy, is symptomatic of it having no trust in the strength of its core design. It's almost like Sega itself has bought the argument that because Sonic stars a cartoon hedgehog, the characters can't be taken remotely seriously. When to me, their design is incidental. If the story is well told, there is no reason that people can't get into it. While I like drama and tension, however, Sonic also can't take itself too seriously either, as that creates juxtaposition between the cartoony visuals and the serious tone, which would be detrimental to an audience's suspension of disbelief. The series, in my opinion, is best positioned as a fantasy adventure like Sonic 3 or indeed Sonic Adventure. It's escapism. It asks its audience to vicariously transport themselves to this fantasy world for a while. The world, while undeniably unrealistic, can't just be nonsense. It has to present itself as having a consistent internal logic in order to suspend its players' disbelief and engage them in the adventure. And again, I don't think it ought to be dismissed simply because the characters are cartoon animals. If the cartoon animals were comedic and the world was nonsense, the game couldn't create and escalate tension as effectively as Sonic 3 or Sonic Adventure do. Okay, basically I feel that Sonic can be a compelling adventure that takes itself seriously, so long as it does so with the understanding that it is a cartoon hedgehog that is fundamentally aimed at children. But rather than sticking to his guns, no, not those guns, Sonic keeps reinventing himself to try and stay relevant, when I think if the series just had some faith in itself, it would still be relevant on its own strengths. Instead, the series can't decide on a tone or a direction, and continues to confuse itself with desperate attempts to ape what's popular. The Werehog, God of War, Generations and Sonic 4, retro nostalgia, Lost World, Super Mario Galaxy. I'm glad that Sonic isn't stagnating, but there's such a thing as too much innovation. And if this spitballing is reflective of the way the games have been made in general, well, it's no wonder Sonic's been having such a rough time. So maybe a reboot is needed. Just, pare everything back, get back to basics. Well, evidently Sega had the same thought, as in 2014 we got the latest Sonic reboot, Sonic Boom. When Sonic Boom was announced, Sega were quick to assure us that this was a spin-off rather than a reboot. They were suspiciously quick to give themselves a way out should it not be well received. This set off a number of alarm bells for me, as again, there's not very much faith being shown there. And without an ounce of disrespect to anybody involved, it's kind of easy to see why. The series was a collaboration between Sega, We Do Productions, Big Red Button and Sanzaru Games. 4 different companies got in on the creation of Sonic Boom. And, well, despite a giant marketing push, it doesn't really seem to have had much lasting effect beyond making the series less watertight again. Sonic Boom exudes a light-hearted vibe, with its focus being on the wacky and humorous interactions between the 6 principal characters: Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, Amy, newcomer Styx the Badger, and Dr. Eggman. It takes place in a brand new world, which is refreshingly simple in that it's a cartoon world designed for adventure, and filled with anthropomorphic animals like Sonic. It feels like they made a decision about what the world would be like and stuck to it. Unfortunately, the same can't be said of the rest of Sonic Boom. The reboot begins with a horribly received game designed to introduce the world of the TV show, but as far as I can tell, it utterly fails to do so, already running on the assumption that you know who the characters are. It instead focuses on establishing its new villain, Lyric, who as far as I know hasn't made an appearance in the show itself at the time of writing. So basically the game has nothing to do with the show. The show is centred on Sonic and his friends living in a hut and engaging in wacky sitcom altercations with Eggman. The relationship between Sonic and Eggman has changed, with the pair treating their frequent fights as more of a formality and being fairly amicable outside of this. Sonic Boom also featured new redesigns for the cast, marketed towards a Western audience. This is a wee bit of a bizarre decision in my opinion, as Sonic was already designed for a Western audience in the first place, this being his original design, but that's neither here nor there. Sonic himself has been made taller and has been covered in sports tape and given a scarf, which is an homage to adventure series like Uncharted. Now, the designers claim that the sports tape is to give off the vibe that the characters are nomad adventurers, not really fussed about how they look, as they have to keep on the move. For Sonic though, all of these extra details only get in the way of his streamlined design. Again, Sonic is built to run and curl into a ball. I can only imagine that the scarf, the sports tape and the extra height would get in the way of these abilities, but that's not really the problem. The problem is that these only distract from the strength of Sonic's design. I mean, it is still a strong design, but that's entirely because of Sonic's original design. There isn't an ounce of fat on regular Sonic, metaphorically speaking, and while these additions don't ruin the design, they don't add anything, they just kind of clutter it up. Dr. Eggman's military general look is a great idea, I feel, giving off the idea of him being a scientist, but also like a commander for his robots. But he's no longer shaped like an egg. Like, I consider that to be a little questionable considering, him being an egg is his bread and butter. If you've been paying close attention, you might be able to notice that it's there in his name, see? Tails and Amy's designs are largely untouched, and unfortunately probably the best of the redesigns for it. Tails wears goggles and has a tool belt, finally communicating visually what his major character trait has been for over a decade. Amy still doesn't look like her major trait is hammering things, but other than that she's just as good as the regular Amy is. The newcomer Styx, though, is happily a great design. Her head is shaped like a boomerang, instantly associating her with the weapons that she wields. Her feral nature is also demonstrated clearly to the viewer through her tattered clothing and the makeshift baubles in her hair. The only thing I think doesn't really fit with Styx is that, despite everything about her communicating that she's wild and uncivilized, a lot of her humour is derived from her paranoia about government conspiracies of all things. Still, that aside, if this was the result, I'm a bit disappointed that the designers didn't get the chance to design their own characters more often. Now we come to the big one, literally, which is Knuckles' design. And, with the utmost respect to everybody involved again, I don't think this looks very good. In their defence, the designers were probably going for something else, but were constrained by strict guidelines from the executives, who were understandably trying to maintain brand recognition. As such, I don't think it's insane that it turned out like this, and I don't think it's reflective of the designer's abilities, I just think it's a bit unfortunate. The first thing that jumps out at me is how awkward this looks. I understand that typically broader shoulders and a bigger torso communicate strength, and maybe it's because I'm used to the regular Knuckles, but it really does look like a comedy Photoshop job, like somebody deliberately doing a poor job of putting their head on a strong character's body. Because the body is so big and his hands are much smaller than they were, attention is drawn to Knuckles' torso rather than his knuckles. It means that when Knuckles is punching, I'm focusing here rather than here, and it feels like it should be the other way around. He also has fingered gloves now, although to be honest I can see the logic behind that particular decision. As a character designed primarily for a CGI animated series, it would be tricky to animate the characters doing things like writing or eating or, say, typing with boxing gloves on his hands. The biggest problem for me though is that Knuckles now has literally no excuse for running fast. Not only does his character design no longer suggest that he can run fast, it actively suggests the opposite. Knuckles has a huge body with tiny, comically undersized legs. This is character design shorthand in most cases for a character that is tough and strong, but also quite slow. I know I've used this game before in the last video, but take Heavy Weapons Guy from Team Fortress 2 for example. His large body and bulky arms communicate his strength and endurance, while his comically disproportionate, underweight legs communicate that he is slow. Lo and behold, he has the highest damage output in the game, has the most health in the game, but he's also the slowest character in the game. In Rise of Lyric, I don't even think Knuckles is any stronger than the rest of the characters. I haven't played it, but watching gameplay footage online and reading some wikis seem to suggest that this is the case. So Knuckles' strength is no greater than anyone else's, and his speed is the same as everyone else's, but his character design communicates the exact opposite. While I'm on the subject actually, am I the only one a little disappointed that Knuckles has been a laughingstock for ages? He's always been one of my favourites. I mean, yeah, he got tricked a few times because he was supposed to be naive, but that seems to have devolved into him being completely thick. And while I know it doesn't really matter, I still think it's a bit of a shame that one of Sonic Team's best creations, the main rival in an absolutely wonderful game, is now reduced to lazily written comic relief. I don't have a problem bridging the gap between the old series and Sonic Boom there, as, well, the characters are pretty much the same as they always were. Sure, there have been a few details changed here and there, but it's pretty much business as usual for Sonic & Co, so I can't help but feel that the whole thing accomplished very little but to boost Sonic's public profile. But that is a very temporary, short-sighted boost. You see, in a few years when the boom bubble bursts, you're going to have a lot of people missing it and wishing that, for example, Knuckles was bulky again. But then, of course, if you make Knuckles bulky, you'll have a lot of people wanting you to change him back. Do you see the problem? Change has to be handled very carefully, especially drastic changes like this one. Again, by making a change, you tacitly ask your audience to have a preference. Once that change is made, whether or not you stick to it, you will create disappointment, as you inevitably have to dismiss a portion of your audience's preference. Whereas if the change was never made in the first place, that preference wouldn't exist, and if the audience don't like the product, then they're not your audience. Sega, through constant revisions, are simply creating dissent for themselves later on. If nothing else, I think it implies that Sega don't have confidence in the appeal of their characters, and if they don't have confidence, then why the heck should we? Sonic Boom's design, spread as it was between 4 different companies, is extraordinarily confused. I want you to imagine how chaotic the creative process behind this must have been. The creative process that resulted in changes to the character designs that recast them as nomad adventurers, only to have them live in a house by the beach and engage in wacky sitcom antics. It feels like all the different companies behind the different parts of Sonic Boom had very different ideas of what they wanted the end product to be. Now, credit where it's due, I watched a couple of episodes of the TV show, and while I have no intention of watching it religiously, but largely because I'm self-conscious about taking up yet more of my brain space with Sonic the Bloody Hedgehog, I enjoyed it. All my criticisms aside, it is perfectly serviceable children's entertainment. But it isn't really Sonic. It's good on the strengths of it being a sitcom. I remember saying when it was first announced that if the Boom game was any good, it would be because of its similarities to other games rather than because of Sonic. Now, of course, that didn't hold true, as apparently the game isn't very good, but it's held true for me for the TV show. Frankly, I think you could easily replace Sonic and his friends with any other leader, Science One, Dumb but Strong One, Girl One, and Crazy One, and retain much the same effect because the characters are so cookie cutter for a children's sitcom. I'm definitely not against Sonic going in new directions, but those new directions have to complement Sonic, rather than just slapping his mug on a new show. I mean, the Sonic Boom game is absolutely nothing like a Sonic game. I think this is symptomatic of Sega, again, not really thinking it through. They're just throwing out another annual release with a marketable gimmick, and not giving their creators the time to make a quality product. Sonic Boom evidently had an incredibly troubled development that I won't go into, but I think Sega's insistence on crunching out Sonic game after Sonic game is doing irreparable damage to this series. I mean, the Boom team obviously had some really talented people aboard, but they obviously didn't have the time to capitalise on some of these amazing concepts. I think Sega's policy of yearly releases has damaged Sonic's credibility almost beyond repair. Every bad or mediocre release only cheapens the Sonic brand. The big shame is, they were so close to having the series back under control. Just before Sonic Boom was announced, there had been a streak of good games, with the slight blip being Sonic Lost World, and there were only 2 continuities. The games and the Archie comics, both of which presented similar tones, designs and intents. Neither were perfect, but they were both much better than anything we've had by sole virtue of the fact that they presented a unified front, a consolidated idea of what Sonic is, that you either liked or you didn't. Now we have those two, Sonic Boom, and apparently a live-action movie coming out as well. Now, I'm not going to say anything about what I think of that idea, but here's a scary thought. What if it's good? What if the Sonic movie gains a following? Then we have another fracture in the Sonic fanbase, and we have fans clamouring for that continuity to be included in the Sonic series. Sega are caught between fans of the comedic series, fans of the dark and dramatic series, fans of Sonic Underground, fans of Sonic X, fans of the OVA, fans of the British comics, fans of the American comics, fans of the American comics back when it was about relationship dramas, fans of the American comics pre-reboot, fans of the American comics post-reboot, fans of the classic games, fans of the adventure games, fans of the dark and gritty games, fans of the comedic games, fans of Sonic Boom, and now maybe fans of the Sonic movie. It's no wonder Sonic fans are unpleasable. The world and characters that they love in Sonic are likely to be the thing tossed out with the next big reboot. I mean, look, I get it. Sega is a business and businesses have to make money. That's not evil. But as a result of their indiscretion, Sega are now in the tremendously awkward position of having no idea what their dedicated fanbase wants. If they release a comedy, a lot of the fans will hate it. If they release a drama, same deal. I mean, heck, you know the whole core appeal of the series, like the concept I introduced last time that I have based this entire video's arguments on. That's probably not the core appeal for so many people. And to condense this entire video down to a single sentence, the Sonic series doesn't have an identity. Sonic has gone through so many gameplay styles, so many tones, art styles and design sensibilities that it doesn't have a focus. It doesn't know what it is, and it doesn't know what it wants to be. I mean, guys, I've not even talked about that time that Sonic had a sword. The fans can't agree on Sonic because we can't tell what Sonic is. And, well, that's the problem with Sonic spitballing so hard and so fast. I sincerely appreciate the constant imagination that goes into these games, but I think it has long since lost sight of its strengths in amongst over 20 years of conflicting information. There are many strengths that the Sonic series has had that are incompatible with other strengths that the series has had. There are some weaknesses that other continuities patch over and fix, only for those fixes to be tossed out with the next big reboot. It means that, I can like Sonic, and you can like Sonic, but I can dislike almost everything that you like about Sonic and vice versa. That's kind of been the catch-22 with this whole video, and I totally expect to get more than a few comments making totally legit arguments against my points. Is there a solution? Well, I don't know, I can't know, I'm not a game designer. But from my perspective, what it looks like the series needs, as simple as it sounds, is clarity and a cohesive, well-reasoned direction. To have all of the writers, artists, character designers and game designers on the same page, all with a strong direction to follow and a solid idea of what they want the end product to be. To have a basic, well thought out core design. To have them scrutinise every new element to make sure that it will add something to that core design. And, of course, for Sega to give the developers enough time to polish their game. And if that resulting game isn't what I, or any other fan, see as the right way to do Sonic games, then so long as it's internally consistent, I don't see that as a problem. So that's the end of part 2 of Sonic Spitball. Now, I've talked about the gameplay, and I've talked about the not gameplay, so you may be wondering what else is there? Well, you're going to have to wait until the third and final part to find out. That, ladies and gents, is what we call a sequel hook. Thanks very much for watching and have a great day. Cheers!